right, thanks, Juan. And if you've got your little cups, whack them on the floor, and there'll be a bin outside for you later. We're talking about relationships last week, and this week we're really focusing on relationships. And relationships are so key to every aspect of our lives. Today we're particularly talking about marriage relationships. And I want to talk about Christian marriage. Because when we think about marriage, in our culture, there's a view of what marriage is. But as I've been thinking about marriage, I've been thinking about the differences really between what our culture's view of marriage is and what the Christian view of marriage is. And it's quite different. And it's different because we view marriage, or Christians view marriage, through the lens of the Bible. But marriage, the word, the meaning, the understanding is universal, is across our world. Marriage isn't just a Christian thing. So there are people of different faith backgrounds who get married. There are people across different countries around our world that get married. Marriage is not just a thing that we can say, oh, it's a Christian thing, so we need to define it. It's been defined all over the world. And for Australia, there is a Christian definition of marriage, and that definition is this up on the screen. Marriage is the union of two people to the exclusion of all others, voluntarily entered into for life. So that's the Australian government's definition of marriage. And so we can break that down and we can have a look at it. We can say that marriage is the union. So there's something about coming together in marriage of two people. So it can't be three, restricted to two. You can't marry yourself. It can't be one. So marriage is for two people. Now, it was only in 2017 that this was reviewed. It used to say between a man and a woman. Now it's changed. So what we can see is that countries, cultures can redefine what marriage means. And so in Australia, they voted, and it was a change from a man and woman to two people, so that same-sex couples can now get married. So you can see how marriage is different because of that. To the exclusion of all others, voluntarily entered into for life. So the expectation in marriage, it's a lifelong commitment. So that is what our culture, that's Australian marriage. But there's a difference. And the difference that I want to bring out is to explain the difference between what our culture's view of marriage is and what a Christian view of marriage is. Kirsten and I have been watching The Crown. Any people watch The Crown here? There's a couple of us. It's a drama on Netflix, and it goes and speaks about the royal family. And so we're in, I think it's season 4 at the moment, and so the Queen is much more perhaps the Queen that we might remember in our lifetime, kind of the 90s through to probably just the 90s actually, season 4. And it's been interesting because pretty much the whole series is around it's around relationships. One particular relationship that broke down in the 90s, which is Charles and Diana's marriage. But it reflects upon a lot upon the Queen, her views, and it's fiction, okay? I know that, just in case you're wondering that, well... But it is fiction, but they try to piece together things of public knowledge and turn it into this drama. One of the episodes, it looked at Prince Philip, the Queen's husband, and their relationship, his relationship with the Queen. And it showed him doing things, and their conversations were that they were very different. And at the end of the episode, the Queen and Prince Philip had this dialogue. Again, it's fiction, but they kind of came to this point, and the Queen is like staid, and she's like the serious one. She's holding on traditional values. She holds on to her place as the head of the Church of England, and she just sees marriage as you just got to push through, and he's like, oh, we're so different. There's so many differences, and they kind of came to this conclusion. Well, that's marriage. You come together, you grow different, but you stick together. And that was kind of her reflection of what marriage should be. Fictional, I know, but when we think about what marriage is in our world today, for some people, it's you've got to hold on and stick to it no matter what. That's kind of the staid thing. But Kirsten and I, when we were watching this, we're like, no, it's not about two people that come together but then grow apart. Actually, it's working on trying to connect with each other's interests enough that you're not miles apart, but you stick together. So there was a difference in understanding, opinion between what the Crown was showing of marriage and what Kirsten and I were viewing as marriage. And I think it comes down to the difference between our culture's view of marriage and a Christian view of marriage. So what then is a Christian view of marriage? Well, in similar ways to how the Australian government defines marriage, Christian marriage is still a union of two people. But the sense of that union, when we speak of a union, we're talking about sexual interaction. For Christians, that union only happens within the bounds of marriage. I do a number of marriages throughout my, career as a pastor, and a number of them are for family members and friends and people I know or people who want to get married here in the church for whatever reasons. And so I marry a bunch of people who are Christians and a bunch of people who aren't yet Christians or may never be Christians. And it's really interesting to discuss in the pre-marriage counselling. I see it as a great opportunity to be able to speak into their lives and hopefully share the gospel message in the midst of that. That's kind of my, sneaky sideline desire, to be able to tell them about Jesus as we go through. And so as I've navigated through these pre-marriage counselling sessions with different couples over the years, it's really interesting that the majority of those, actually all that I've married that are outside of the church, have been together for probably 10 to 20 years. They pretty much all have children. This is those who are outside the church. They kind of have come to a point of either wanting the same last name or they know, they've been together for 20 years. It's time. We should probably, get married. They want to have a celebration in front of friends. They want everyone to celebrate with them this thing called marriage. And it's interesting when you think about what the world sees as marriage is quite different when you see a Christian view of marriage saying this union, this sexual coming togetherness is not about after you've been together for 20 years, but actually the Christian view of marriage is that sex is to be held within the bounds of a lifelong monogamous relationship of marriage. And so we see this sexual union being very different from the world's view of marriage. This coming together being very different from what the rest of the world sees. This ideal that we have of Christian marriage is a coming together for the first time on your wedding night. And people from outside of the church would look at that and just laugh and think, no, that's crazy. That's the idea of that is just ridiculous. Surely you have to try before you buy. And they go through all of these ideas, these examples of why. But the interesting thing is that surveys continue to tell us time and time again that the best sex isn't a 17-year-old hooking up with someone on Schoolies Week, but it's actually the lifelong monogamous relationship of a couple who love one another so much that they want to be intimate with each other, even though they've been married for many years. So studies lean towards the Christian view of marriage is actually the best sex that you can ever have, even though our culture would think differently. So Christian marriage has a connection with union that's different. Christian marriage also is between two people, but those two people must be from different genders. Now this is different, and obviously our marriage, as I said, has been redefined in recent years, but this historical view of marriage, which has lasted through most cultures for the last 2,000 years, is being redefined in our time. And it's an interesting time to live, to see this not just acceptance, but this drive towards wanting to see more and more same-sex marriages taking place. But again, Christian marriage looks through the lens of the Bible that says that we are designed to sexually fit in a particular way for procreation. That the design of marriage is to have a stable community for children to be born. That the design of marriage is that God had created us male and female, and the coming together of those two, there's a connection that two males or two females doesn't allow. And so God's design is for marriage to be a male-female union. It's also to be voluntarily, and it's also designed for life. But that's actually not Christian marriage. Christian marriage isn't defined because of it's male and female or because of sex within marriage. Actually, Christian marriage, I think, can be defined better when we look through the lens of the Bible, especially a chapter in Ephesians. Now, later in this chapter, it speaks of wives submitting to husbands, and that's a very strong passage, and we'll talk about that. But the passage begins like this. It says, "Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." That, I believe, is the difference between secular marriage, culture marriage, and Christian marriage. Now, it's the difference between being not a Christian and a Christian as well. So when Paul is writing this, Ephesians chapter 5, it's not like the marriage verse. It gets into marriage later, but it begins in this sense of walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. So this is saying that the Christian life and Christian marriage must be selfless. There's something about the connectedness between us and God through the relationship we have with Jesus that sets our relationship of Christians apart from anyone else. But in marriage, it sets us up very differently. Marriage then needs to be a mirror, a copying, a play of the gospel, of what Jesus did for us by seeing our great need and coming to earth, living a perfect life, and as we just celebrated, dying on the cross for our sins. Jesus saw what we needed and was willing to be sacrificed, to be our sacrifice, to be a perfect sacrifice for us. So too then, we're called to love each other in that same way. So what is Christian marriage? It's the selfless desire to give ourselves over to someone else for their best, to bring about their joy, to bring about their fullness, to fill in areas of their weakness and vulnerability that they need us to stand in that gap for them, and allowing them to do likewise to us. So we then become Jesus to our partner, and they in turn become Jesus for us, living not so that they can be first, but so that they can give themselves for their partner. So Christian marriage is defined by the cross, and it's lived out in light of the gospel. So that as people see our marriages, they don't see it's a lifelong commitment between two people voluntarily entered into. They see, wow, there's love that's different because it's self-sacrificial love, because it's based on our relationship with Jesus. It's based on what he already has done for us. Can you see that? That's a pretty starkly different definition of marriage than the definition that even someone who loves one another, and I'm not looking down on those people who have a different definition of marriage. That's not my aim here. If you're not in a relationship with Jesus, you can't come to marriage in that same way. You don't have a Christian marriage, and that's fine, because my intent, my heart in preaching this is not to look down on other forms of marriage. It's to say that we have a uniquely different type of marriage that we're called to, because if you follow Jesus, then you follow him through the lens of the scriptures he's given us to help us to understand how then we're called to live. Does that make sense? You with me? Okay, so then we move to this scary, difficult, hard passage that people have fought over, and then people say, well, I'm not going to do that, I can't believe you do that, and it goes a little like this. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands, as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So here's a scenario. He's just received a promotion at work. It's a great promotion. It's a step up. It's what he's always wanted. The downside is to take that promotion, he's got to move his family up to Rockhampton. And he's got a wife and 2 kids, and they're in high school. And so they've got a decision to make. What do they do? Well, he could say, well, it would be best for us to move to Rockhampton. It's a pay increase. It's a better job, more challenging. It's what I've always wanted. So is he right for them to move to Rockhampton? Yes. She's got family here in Ipswich. She's got her kids in schools. They've got friends. They've got connections. Is it right for her to desire to want to live in Ipswich? Yes. So what's the answer? What do? How do they make a decision about what they will do, not what's right? Both seem right. Another scenario, he's just been on a long week away with work. He's been away from his family, called every night. They've kind of stayed in touch, but at the end of the week, he's been talking to his wife, and he's kind of hoping that when he gets back, they'll be a little bit intimate together, and he's really looking forward to that. He gets home, and she's exhausted. She's had 4 kids under 6 years old. They've been ratty all week. It's been terrible, and as soon as he comes home, she just grabs the kids and goes, "You look after them. I need to get to bed. I am just exhausted, tired. I want an early night." And he's like, And he's like, "No, without you, by myself." And so what should they do? What's the right decision? Because he's been away and he has longings and desires. She's exhausted. She just wants to get to bed without him and get rid of the kids for some alone time. Who's right? What decision do you make? We go back to what it says in the beginning. It says, "Steelers, walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." So that's the lens that we have to look through these next 2 things. That's the lens that the husband has to look into as he then views Scripture and reads his part of this that says, "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church." You know, it's easy to fall back on, we'll stay in Brisbane, I'll let her go to bed, and because happy wife, happy life, right? We all like that saying, but it doesn't actually always lead to a happy marriage. Or should she look at this and say, well, it says that I have to submit, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so in submission, then we're just going to move to Rockhampton, and I'm going to, wait up late, put the kids to bed, and then have intimate time with my husband. What's right? Well, when you actually look at this, the word submission and the word love doesn't mean that she has to do what he says all the time and he's in control. It doesn't mean that he just gives up anything to make sure that she's happy. But actually it means that you go back and you say, what does love and the kind of sacrifice that Jesus gave mean for us? So that might mean that when he looks at the situation, he says, well, what will she lose when we move to Rockhampton? If we went to Rockhampton, what would that mean for her? Oh man, that is too much. I have to sacrifice my career so that she can be with her family, our kids can finish high school. That's right. It's also right to come to the point of saying, well, we're going to have to sacrifice our budget and every school holidays, they're flying back down, seeing family, seeing friends. That could be right as well. It could be right for her to say, well, he's always wanted this in his career. I want to make sure that he keeps growing and developing. So we'll do whatever we can to make sure that he grows. You see how both are right? And so when we look at this passage, in light of loving sacrifice, both the wife and the husband need to come to this to say, how do I put them first? How do I connect to help them? And actually, in this situation, when we look at this and say, husbands, love your wife, it's saying sacrifice just as Christ sacrificed himself for the church. So Jesus went to the cross, he died. So that's what we have to do, men. We have to be willing to die. Women, you just have to be submissive. And it sounds like that sounds flippant, but at the same time, wouldn't you want to give the decision making to someone who is willing to give everything for you? wouldn't you say, wow, well, they're willing to die for me. It's likely I'm going to get the way that I want more than he is, because he's going to give himself for me. And wouldn't he then look at that submission and say, well, she is going to give herself to me because she knows that I'm going to make a sacrificial decision for her. These decisions that we make that come under this kind of love and submission actually might only happen a couple of times in our entire lives of marriage. Most of the times, decisions are made because we talk about them, we go through the decision, we work it out together, and a solution comes. The best solution just kind of fits. So the majority of time, that's how things work out. But when we look at what this verse is saying, it's saying for those other times, those key times, those moments that you need to come to this, then wives, submit to your husbands. It's not saying husbands tell your wives to submit. It's saying wives, submit to your husbands. And it's not saying wives tell your husbands to love, but husbands, under God, love your wives. Why? Because Jesus loved his church enough to submit, but he also submitted himself to the will of the Father. You see how this dance, this interplay happens. And why? Why does this need to be said to us? Why do we need to have this clearly laid out vision of marriage? It's because ultimately, we're selfish. I don't know about you, but I think of me more than I do anyone else. It's my natural inclination. I'm hungry. It's me that feels the hunger, and so I look for food. I have a job that I want to do, so I look to how do I progress in my job. I have desires, so I go about seeking out. We are with ourselves more than we are with anyone else, and so we become the one that we're so focused on. It's easy for us to fall into selfishness, that we need to be told time and time again, the gospel needs to be preached to our hearts. We need to keep reminding what Jesus did for us so that we pull ourselves away from selfishness and into the space that God has called us to, which is to say that he actually is the number one spot in our lives. He has the priority. On the dais at the end of life, we say, Jesus, you're the champion. You're number one. You fit in number one place. And then we say, and this is a hard one for those of us like me who are selfish, then we say that our partners are the silver medal winners. And we're bronze. Oh man, third place? Oh, who wants to be in third place? Not me. But this is the picture that we're getting from this, that Jesus is first in our life. We put him in that way. And then our partner becomes second. We serve them. We give ourselves for them. And if you're the wife thinking, yes, I'm silver place. Actually, there's a picture for you as well. You put yourself as third place and your husband as second. And this way, this interplay works because, have a think about this. If you put your wife as the number one position in your life, then what happens when she disappoints you? What happens if you put that weight onto her, that she has to be the one who solves every problem and who is great all the time? She's going to be not great some of the time, and you'll question why. You'll be frustrated. Or if she gets sick, or if you're separated, then she's not number one anymore. What's happening? Your life falls apart. We see this all the time. Or if you put your kids at number one spot and your kids leave, and you're like, oh, they were my meaning in life. Jesus doesn't leave us. He doesn't get sick. He doesn't go away. He doesn't disappoint. He is always first. So he's worthy of putting ourselves into, he's worthy of holding on to that position of number one. And then if we have our wives as number two, if we have our husbands as number two, then we seek to serve them. We push away that selfish desire to serve them. As I said, I had a number of times where I've done pre-marriage counseling with a couple, and one couple that I had a discussion with, it was going well. They loved each other, they'd been together for a number of years, and they'd finally come to the point where they wanted to get married. We were in the third week of our pre-marriage counseling, and we started to talk about money. And I thought it was going okay until she needed to nip out to the bathroom, and he just said to me, oh man, that was so awkward. I just need to tell you, can we move on from the money thing? Because it's really hard in our relationship. When we started out, I didn't know it was going to go, permanently full time like it is now. And I earned 4 times what she does. She's in childcare. He was in a really well-paying job, and he'd been making her pay half the whole time, right? That is, And they'd been together for a few years now, and she didn't know that he was earning 4 times what she did. So they'd be going out to restaurants, and he'd be like, well, it's your turn. And he's getting 4 times what she. And so he's like, well, when we get married, we'll have separate bank accounts. It'll all be sweet. It'll be okay. And so she came back from using the bathroom, and we talked about money for a lot time longer, because I knew that was, for him, self was number one. He was the number one in their marriage, and he wanted to hold on to money, and his selfishness would have ripped them apart. And so we needed to go through that and discuss that, and it ended up being better, eventually better than it would have been if he just kept that lie going. Another couple that I did pre-marriage counseling with, she had a daughter from her first marriage who was an adult who had who always had spending habits that meant that she always got into trouble. And so she'd always then come back to her mum and ask for more money, and her mum would always bail her out. And now that they were the mum with this other guy, they were wanting to get married, and he was seeing this money just leaving the account and wondering what was happening and not seeing anything for it, and asking. And it came up in our pre-marriage counseling that she was continuing to bail out this other her daughter, and it meant that he couldn't trust her with that. And it was incredibly sad, because as we talked about this, she couldn't bring herself to distance herself from her daughter, to put boundaries in place, and to be with him. She put her daughter at that number one space. So you can see that whenever we are selfish, or whenever we put things that are as number one that shouldn't be, what ends up happening is that we end up having secrets, we end up having conflict, we end up having difficulty, and it falls apart. But when we put Jesus in his rightful spot, when we have marriage that is a selfless endeavor, trying to lift up the other person and helping them out, then we start to be the kind of marriage that people see light and joy and hope in. For Kirsten and I just think about what she fills in my gaps. I think about the times where maybe I get too angry with the kids, and she'll be like, whoa, calm it down. Or when I'm thinking about, we're going to go in this direction, and pushing forward, and she's like, maybe you need to take a step back. When I'm getting too aggressive driving, and she's like, maybe you need to calm down. She fills the gaps in me. She fills those spaces in me that aren't godly, that aren't good, that need help. She sees that, and she speaks into that, because she makes me better as a husband, as a man, as a Christian, because of her life with me. And that's the hope, that we would be that for our partner, and that we would trust that they would be that for us. Christian marriage is incredibly good when we give ourselves to the other and live in that gospel relationship of putting Jesus first and making sure that we live our lives in love of him and service to others. It's a tough gig. It's one that we need to look at our whole lives and keep coming back to and thinking, man, how do I go about that? I've stuffed up. I need to fix. I need to keep doing better. But it's worth it. It's worth it because people see Jesus in us when we live in such a way. Let's pray.